Back in the early 80s, I didn't realize it, but we were the start of something new in our families. The first real explosion of mixed Japanese Canadians. I guess you could say, a bunch of banana milkshakes. Yep, a yellow banana with a big scoop of vanilla ice cream. Blend it up, and whoop-ah, you've got us. As a child growing up in Canada, I struggled trying to make sense out of my multiracial background. Little did I know that it would take 20 years before I would finally come to realize that we were really one big Hapa family. I went to Japan when I finished What Are You Anyways, in a little after, I think it was 2005. And I've never felt so white in my entire life. You know, being in Canada and growing up in a city that was very Caucasian, you know, I always sort of stood out because I was the minority kid, right? And even though I'm fourth generation Canadian, you know, my family came here in 1907. I struggled with being Canadian, and what does that mean, being Canadian? So I always felt, you know, very Japanese in Canada. But when I went to Japan, I felt so white because nobody in Japan believed me that I was Japanese. They're like, oh, no, you're not Japanese, you know, and that's what they kept saying that to me, and I felt really alienated. And I don't speak the language because, you know, Japanese Canadians, a lot of them after World War II were never taught the language, right, for fear of an accent or for fear of public ridicule for speaking a language other than English, right, because there was so much pressure and so much racism that the elders of the Japanese community didn't teach their children Japanese. So I never learned Japanese, and that's something I really regret, that I really wish I would have learned how to speak the language. So going to Japan, I just felt like a foreigner, right? And I tried to find a sense of community, a sense of, like trying to find my roots, right? And it didn't really happen. You know, I felt a little bit of spirituality here and there through some experiences I had with being in a bamboo forest and hearing the wind blow through the bamboo and being at complete peace. And I kind of felt maybe there was a part of me that had been here before, or my family, right? But coming home, I think I would like to go back to Japan again, but not with as high of expectations, I think, because I wasn't sure what I was going there to. I was hoping to find something, which I didn't really find, you know. So I think now, sort of going on this bigger journey, this 4-year journey, I feel like maybe now I can go back with a little more insight. So what was the reason why your parents wanted you to marry other Japanese?
Custom, I guess, and to keep the bloodline in the, I think Japanese people, for example, in Japan, are very strict in marriage. And if we take a look at the way in which things are set up there, they want to keep the bloodline true. And so I guess my parents had that instilled in them, and they still believed in that when they came to Canada. They came here and took employment immediately, and they never had an opportunity to go to school, to learn English. And so to be able to communicate with one another, they created Japanese communities. And so because of that, then of course they would, you know, marry into the Japanese. Whereas when it became the Niseis, my age, my parents, for example, said, you're going to be rubbing shoulders with the Caucasian, you know, the white people. And so, although you are shorter in stature, make sure that your head is higher. With the Second World War having dispersed us across Canada, and our first generation parents realizing that although they had the desire for their children to marry into Japanese families, that their children are brought up in a different way, in a different world, they more or less accepted that their children will intermarry with other nationalities and also color.
Well, you know, it's interesting because we look at that in the documentary, that a lot of the older generation, the elders in the Japanese community in Canada, are really scared that we're going to lose a lot of Japanese Canadian history and heritage because we're mixing, right? So the kids are becoming more blended. They don't look Japanese. Like if you look at my face, you know, I'm losing the Japanese characteristics. And so they're kind of worried that we're losing that Japanese Canadian sort of tradition. But what they're not understanding is that that's also happening in Japan, right? You know, a lot of it's becoming more Western. And after World War II, it became very Western. Right, so I think a lot of people are very surprised in Canada when they go back to Japan. I get a lot of sort of Nikkei come up to me who were born here, and they tell me their stories about going to Japan, and they're full Japanese Canadian. They look Japanese, and they go to Japan, and they feel very out of place as well too, because they aren't treated as being Japanese. They're Canadian, right? And so I think with that, I think it's a really sort of it's a sensitive area, right, for a lot of Japanese Canadians, that they want to sort of go back and find something, and it's not there, and it's becoming so much more westernized as well too, right? That the cities, are looking a lot more like, American cities, and we're becoming more of a global society. So, it's nice that some communities are taking up taiko drumming, or they're doing the dancing, and they're still practicing a lot of sort of the Japanese traditions. But I think, like us people, we're going to evolve, right? And we are evolving, and we are shifting, and we are changing. And that's what I keep telling the Japanese community in Canada, is that we're going to shift, we're going to evolve, we're going to change. Things are not going to be the same as they were 50 years ago, and that's a good thing, right? As people, as communities, we need to evolve. And so, it's going to be okay. I keep having to tell them it's going to be okay, because I think they're really worried that, the kids are going to grow up and they're not going to care about that Japanese part of them. But what I found is that they do, and they care a lot. And even though they may not want to do a lot of traditional things, that is creating a new sense of heritage and history and culture in Canada.
Look at how many third-generation Sansei Japanese in the country can actually speak the language. In our family, none of them can speak Japanese, not one fluently. And again, this goes back to the fact we were not taught the language in the household for fear of accents or fear of public retribution for speaking a language outside of English, because they wanted us to be as Western as possible.
I've always had a philosophy that the work I do always encompasses something where a family could watch it together, and that there's philosophical elements, and there's also elements that, are enriching and enlightening and inspiring. And I don't ever stray from that, right? I will never do anything that is crass or that I find is not wholesome to a family to view. So that's been my philosophy, and I've always stuck to that. And for the past 10 years of creating film and animation, I've been able to stick to that philosophy. And as long as I continue to do that till, the day I die, I'm a happy man.